The Namibian heartland was built for sun-wide skies, dry wind, red earth that remembered every footprint. So, when the rain arrived early and violent, the whole savanna seemed to speak in a different voice.
Come on,
The
little fella, you can
downpour
do it.
turned dust into slick clay, pulled scents up from the ground, and made every sound feel closer than it truly was. Jack Turner stood on the porch of his small timber cabin and watched the storm move across the low hills like a slow gray animal. He could smell wet soil and iron-rich mud. He could hear raindrops knocking hollow on the water tank beside the house. Out here, rain meant grass and relief, but it also meant collapse, flood, and trouble. Jack slid into his old boots, threw a poncho over his shoulders, and told himself he was only going to check the drainage cut behind the fence line. A quick walk, a quick look. Then back to coffee quiet and the life he'd come here to live. He'd retired 3 years ago, left behind the sirens, the smoke, the heat that climbed walls and stole oxygen. He hadn't come to Africa to be a hero again. He'd come to be nobody. But the storm didn't care what a man wanted. Jack followed a narrow track through thorn scrub and wet grass. Water braided between bushes in sudden little streams that would disappear by tomorrow noon. The sky was a low lid of gray pressing down on the world. He was halfway to the gully when he stopped. He heard something. A sound rose and broke, thin, raw, and repeating. Not wind, not bird, too small for anything he recognized from the usual chorus out here. It sounded like a hinge that needed oil. A desperate squeak dragged across the rain like a thread. Jack turned off the track and moved toward it, pushing wet grass aside with his knees. The sound led him to a washout, one of those narrow gullies that only filled when the clouds ran out of patience. Today it was full. The gully had carved deeper than he remembered. The sides were collapsing under the rain, feeding the current with fresh mud. Jack crouched, peered down, and saw the water swirling in a pocket against a snarl of branches. And there, wedged between wood and sludge, was a small body trembling. Tawny fur soaked and darkened. Ear tips almost black. Bright little spots along the legs, the baby markings that hadn't faded yet. The animal was young enough that its shape looked wrong for what it would become. A lion cub. For one breath, Jack didn't move. Every sign on the reserve said the same thing. Observe. Record. Do not interfere. Jack had repeated that rule to visitors with a straight face. Nature didn't need human rescue, not usually. Interference could break patterns older than him, older than language. But the water lapped over the cub's nostrils. It coughed, snorted mud, and cried again, smaller this time, weaker, like the sound was running out. Jack felt something inside him snap free. A memory's smoke alarm screaming, a child crying behind a locked door. His own voice years ago cutting through panic. You can't wait. Not now. All right, he said into the rain voice, low and steady. All right, little one. He slipped his backpack off and pulled out the rope he always carried. The land out here demanded different tools than the city had, but some instincts were the same. He looped the rope around a stout root and tested the knot with a hard tug, then another until it bit and held. He tied the other end around his waist. Then he lay on his belly and reached down. Mud closed cold around his forearms. The current shoved his hands away as if the gully itself had teeth. Jack waited, timed the swing of the water, and plunged deeper. The cub's eyes were open, glassy with grit. Its paws scrabbled at Jack's sleeve with the weak insistence of panic. Jack slid his fingers under a foreleg and felt the tiny heart hammering under wet fur. Easy, he murmured. And he heard his voice take on that calm, practiced tone he used to carry into burning stairwells. You help me. I help you. He eased the cub free of the branch tangle. But mud did what mud always did. It tried to keep what it had. Suction pulled back. Water surged forward. And Jack felt the rope bite into his waist as the whole weight of the gully tried to drag him in with it. His boots slipped. One heel found nothing. His left shoulder slammed into the bank hard enough to flash white behind his eyes. The cub cried again, thin and frightened. Jack pulled its small body tight against his chest to keep its head above the water, while the current thrashed his thighs. "Hold on," he whispered, though he wasn't sure which of them he meant. He pushed with his knees, hunting for a shelf, a ridge, anything. A buried root gave him one stubborn inch. The rope groaned, then held another. Jack found a knot in the bank where the clay hadn't sloughed away. He locked his elbow and dragged his chest over it, mud sucking at his poncho like hands. The cub clung. Tiny claws pricked through fabric, hot needles here and there. Its breath hitched against his collarbone. Jack lifted it higher under his chin and felt the tremor of its ribs, the frantic little shiver of a body that didn't understand why the world had turned into water. When he finally broke the lip of the gully, the world seemed wider again. Rain was just rain. Sound came back in layers, the rattle of drops on leaves, pebbles ticking down the bank, wind sighing across grass that ran toward a blurred horizon. Jack rolled onto his back and let the rope slacken. For a moment he did nothing but breathe and feel the weight of the cub on his chest. It was lighter than he'd expected, all bones and wet fur and outrage, but it was alive. "There you go," he said, softer than he meant to. "There you go." He sat up slowly, testing his shoulder. It throbbed in time with his heartbeat, but the joint held. A scrape burned along his forearm where mud and grit had filed his skin raw. The cub coughed again, pushing out a marble of brown water. Jack wiped mud from its nostrils with his thumb. The little animal blinked long and slow lashes, clumped together, then tucked its head into the hollow under Jack's chin, as if his neck were the only dry shelter left in the storm. Jack swallowed hard. He told himself he would set it down and step away. He told himself he would let the wild return to wild rules. His second life was supposed to be quieter, but the truth trembled in his hands. Sometimes a rule is true until it isn't, and the test arrives wet and shivering and stares up at you with mud in its eyes. Jack knelt on a patch of grass and rubbed along the cub's spine with the heel of his palm, the way a ranger once showed him, with orphaned antelope warmth back into a small body life pulled gently from the edge. The rain softened to a patient drizzle, as if the sky had decided to watch. The cub lifted its head. Its eyes were clearer now, amber beginning to shine through the brown film. Jack lowered his forehead to its crown without thinking, grateful for the warm weight and the steady pulse that wasn't his. "You're safe," he whispered. "For now, you're safe." He set the cub carefully on the grass. It stood on shaky legs, sank to its belly, then tried again and held. The bright spots on its legs showed through the wet fur like constellations. It turned its head and looked back at Jack the way small things do when they're not sure where to put their trust. Jack raised both hands, palms open, an old language older than either of them, "I mean no harm." Then the wind shifted. It carried a smell he recognized by now, sun-cured hide, and something deep and musky, heavy as hot metal. The hair along Jack's forearms lifted. He didn't move. The cub's nose worked. Its ears swiveled toward the ridge above the gully. And then Jack heard it, faint at first, then certain, a low rolling note that lived in the chest more than the ears. Not the full thunder of a territorial roar, something shaped like a mother's call. The cub answered with a small, hopeful chirp that tugged at something under Jack's sternum. Through the curtain of drizzle between two acacia stems, a darker darkness shifted. Jack held himself as still as a man can, forcing his breathing slow. He counted without meaning to 1, 2, 3 like he used to when he waited for a door to give way for a floor to hold. "Easy," he said softly. Maybe to the cub, maybe to the shadow on the ridge, maybe to the part of himself that remembered running into flames because no one else was there yet. The cub took 2 wobbly steps toward the sound, then glanced back over its shoulder as if asking what came next. Jack stayed on one knee, shoulders square, hands visible. He knew what the reserve rules said. He knew what common sense said, too. But the day had already crossed one line, and now another one was walking toward him through the rain. He didn't call out. He didn't run. He waited, listening to that low note roll again, closer now. and felt the land itself hold its breath. He wasn't alone in the storm anymore, and whatever rules would matter tomorrow. This moment belonged to two hearts he could hear clearly, and a third one he could almost see. The sound rolled again, low, steady, carrying weight without threat. Jack felt it vibrate through the ground beneath his boots, through his ribs, settling somewhere deep in his chest. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't anger. It was a call. The cub answered once more. Smaller now, its voice steadier than before. Jack watched it carefully, every muscle in his body tuned to the space between them and the unseen presence on the ridge. The drizzle thinned, hanging in the air like a veil of beads. Through it, the shape above became clearer, not all at once, but in pieces. First the curve of a shoulder, then the line of a powerful neck. Finally, a face that seemed carved from shadow and gold. A lioness stood at the edge of the rise. She was larger than Jack had imagined, even from a distance. Her coat was a deep sandy gold, darkened by rain, clinging to muscle that shifted subtly as she breathed. A faint scar traced across her flank, pale against wet fur. Her eyes, calm, amber, unreadable, fixed first on the cub. Then slowly they moved to Jack. Jack did not move. Every lesson he'd ever learned pressed against his thoughts at once. Don't run, don't stare, don't turn your back. He kept his chin level, his gaze soft, his hands open and still. He let his breathing slow, measured the way it had when smoke filled a room and panic tried to take over. The lioness took one step forward. The cub made a small sound, half question, half relief, and tottered toward her. She answered with a low chuff, gentle but firm. The cub froze, then waited, sitting clumsily on the wet grass. Jack could see the intelligence in her movements. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. She was not reacting, she was assessing. Her gaze returned to him. Jack felt the urge to speak rise in his throat, then settle back down. Words felt too thin for this moment. Instead, he lowered himself slightly, shifting his weight so his posture was less tall, less imposing. He wanted her to see what mattered. He was not blocking her cub, not advancing, not claiming anything. "I'm stepping back," he murmured, more for himself than for her. He eased one knee farther into the grass, creating space between himself and the cub. The movement was slow enough that it felt like time stretched around it. The lioness watched every inch of it. Rain slid from her whiskers, water dripped from her chin. Her tail flicked once, controlled, deliberate. She took another step down the slope. Now Jack could see the full breadth of her, how the ground seemed to accept her weight without protest, how each paw landed exactly where it needed to. She stopped again, no more than 15 yards away. Close enough. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears, but his body stayed quiet. He was acutely aware of his shoulder sore from the fall of the drying mud pulling at his clothes. He wondered if she could smell the cub on him, if the scent told its own story. The cub couldn't wait any longer. It rose and stumbled forward, crossing the space between them with awkward determination. When it reached her, it pressed into her chest, rubbing its head under her jaw. The lioness lowered her head and touched her nose briefly to the top of its skull. Jack exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes, but the lioness did not turn away. She looked at him again, really looked. Her eyes held no fear, no rage, only a kind of focused stillness, as if she were reading something written in the way he held himself, the way his hands were empty, the way he had not fled. Jack felt exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years. He remembered standing in doorways filled with smoke, knowing that whatever decision he made in the next seconds would change everything. This felt the same but quieter, more precise. "I'm not staying," he said softly. "You've got your cub." He shifted back another inch and stopped. The lioness's ears flicked toward him, then back to the cub. The cub looked up at her, then turned and glanced at Jack once more as if memorizing his shape. Then something happened that Jack would replay in his mind for years to come. The lioness lowered her head. Not in threat, not in dominance. It was brief, subtle, her chin dipping toward the grass. her posture softening for a heartbeat before she lifted her gaze again. The cub stayed pressed against her leg-tail, twitching. Jack felt his breath catch. He didn't bow back. He didn't move at all. He only held her gaze steady and open, letting the moment pass without trying to name it. After a long second, she turned. With a quiet rumble, she nudged the cub toward the trees. The cub followed, pausing once to look back. Jack stayed where he was, hands still raised, shoulders square but relaxed. At the edge of the brush, the lioness stopped again. She glanced over her shoulder, one last look, then melted into the thorn trees, her cub. A flicker of movement at her side. The grass closed behind them, stitched together by rain and wind. The savannah exhaled. Jack remained kneeling long after they were gone. Only when his legs began to tremble did he sit back fully, letting the weight of what had happened settle into him. The storm eased. The drizzle faded to mist. Somewhere far off, a bird called, testing whether the world was safe again. Jack wiped mud from his hands and stared at the place where the lioness had stood. He knew what the rules said. He knew what the rangers would say if they knew. But he also knew this, whatever line had existed between him and the wild before today, it had shifted. And deep in his chest, beneath the fading echo of rain, he felt something new take root. Not triumph, not pride. Recognition? The storm lingered through the night, then drifted east with the dawn, leaving the land washed and heavy with scent. By morning, the savannah breathed again, wet grass, clean dust, and the quiet hum of insects reclaiming their territory. Jack Turner woke before the sun the way he often did. Sleep came lightly these days, never staying long. His shoulder ached. Where he'd struck the gully bank, a dull reminder that yesterday had been real. For a moment, sitting on the edge of his bed, he wondered if the rest of it, the cub, the lioness, the lowered head, had been nothing more than exhaustion, stitched together by rain. Then he stood, and the ache sharpened, and memory settled back into place. He brewed coffee on the small propane burner and carried his tin mug out onto the porch. The sky was pale silver, the horizon barely awake. Mist clung low to the grass, turning the world soft around the edges. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. Every time Jack closed his eyes, he saw the cub's face slick with mud, the glassy fear in its eyes before he lifted it free. He told himself the story was over. The cub had been returned. The wild had corrected itself. Still, his gaze kept drifting toward the ridge where the lioness had disappeared. After breakfast, Jack packed a small kit first aid canteen camera and decided to walk the ridgeline. Heavy rain reshaped everything out here. Gullies deepened. Paths vanished overnight. That was the reason he gave himself. The ground was soft under his boots, the earth yielding slightly with each step. He followed the same route as the day before, noting where the soil had collapsed, where new channels had formed. When he reached the bend overlooking the gully, he stopped. The ground there was marked. Jack knelt slowly. The smaller tracks were unmistakable, rounded, light, uneven. A cub's steps, still learning the balance of its own body. They circled the spot where he'd hauled the little animal from the mud. And then there were the others. 4 toes, broad pads, deep impressions pressed clean into the damp soil. The tracks overlapped his own boot prints, cutting across them with quiet authority. A lioness. Jack traced one print with his finger. The edges were crisp, fresh. She had been here after he left. They had come back. He straightened and listened. The savannah carried its own kind of silence, never empty, just layered thin. Weaver birds chattered somewhere far off. Baboons barked faintly in the distance. But closer than that, nothing. No wind in the acacias, no movement in the grass. Jack swallowed. It was the same silence he remembered from his old life. The pause before a door gave way before a fire decided which direction it would run, the world holding its breath. He took a careful step backward. That was when he heard it. A low sound so soft it almost blended with his heartbeat. Not a roar, not even a growl, just a presence made audible. Jack turned slowly. Between the thorn trees, shadow gathered itself into shape. First, the outline of a head, then eyes catching the light like old coins. The lioness stepped into view, water still darkening her coat. She was massive up close. Muscle moved beneath her skin like coiled rope. The scar along her flank stood out pale and smooth against gold. Her gaze fixed on him, steady and unblinking. Jack felt his mouth go dry. Behind her the brush rustled. The cub stumbled into the clearing, tail flicking alive and clumsy. It looked stronger than yesterday, though its movements were still unsure. When it saw Jack, it made a small sound, a high, quick chirp. The lioness's ear flicked toward it. Jack raised his hands slowly, palms open, and took a step back. He remembered every warning he'd ever heard. Don't stare, don't run, don't turn away. I'm not staying, he said quietly. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, too calm, as if it belonged to someone else. You got your cub. That's all I wanted. He crouched and set his camera gently on the ground. The metal caught the sunlight. For reasons he couldn't explain, it felt important that she see he carried nothing else. The cub tottered forward a few steps, curiosity overcoming caution. Its fur had dried into uneven tufts, still spiked with bits of mud. The lioness made a deep chuff, half warning, half reassurance, and the cub froze instantly. Jack watched the rhythm of her breathing, slow, deliberate. She wasn't angry. She was measuring him. The way firefighters measured a blaze, not for emotion, but for reach, for intent, for danger. Jack felt that strange intelligence in her stare. There was no hatred there, only calculation, and beneath it something harder to name. She took one step forward. Her paws made no sound. Another step, 10 feet now, maybe less. Jack could see the detail of her whiskers, the tension near her jaw. Sweat ran down his temple despite the cool air. His legs wanted to move, his mind told them not to. All right, he whispered. You're right. The lioness stopped. She tilted her head slightly, eyes locked on his face. For a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. The man who had crossed a line and the animal who decided what that meant. Then she did something that stole the breath from his chest. She lowered her head, not in threat, not in submission. Something else entirely brief, controlled, unmistakable, an acknowledgement. The cub pressed against her leg, murmuring softly. Jack felt his heart pound so hard it hurt. He did not move. He did not bow. He simply stayed present, letting the moment exist without touching it. The lioness lifted her gaze again, held his for another long second, then turned away. With a low rumble, she nudged the cub toward the trees. The cub followed, glancing back once more before disappearing into the brush. The grass stilled. Jack stood there until his knees began to shake. When he finally looked down, he realized his hands were trembling. He flexed his fingers, grounding himself in the familiar ache of muscle and bone. No one would believe this. A wild lioness lowering her head to a man who had pulled her cub from the mud. It sounded like a story told around fires, not something that happened in daylight. Jack turned toward home boots heavy with drying clay. Relief should have filled him. Instead, a new unease settled in his chest. That look the lioness had given him, it hadn't been just gratitude. It was recognition. And Jack knew with a certainty that made his skin prickle that she would remember him. By evening, the sky had bruised into deep purples and grays, the kind of color that made the savannah feel older than time. Jack Turner washed the mud from his hands at the outdoor basin and poured himself another cup of coffee, though he barely tasted it. The events of the day sat heavy in his chest, refusing to settle. He told himself it was over. The cub was safe. The lioness had reclaimed her young. The rules of the land had reasserted themselves. Tomorrow would be quiet again. Still, when darkness fell, Jack left the porch light on. The yellow cone of light spilled across the clearing, cutting a small island out of the night. He sat inside with the window cracked, listening to the sounds that returned after sunset crickets, testing their rhythm. A distant hyena laugh, the wind brushing dry grass against itself. Sleep came late. Sometime after midnight, Jack woke with the uneasy sense of being watched. It was the same feeling that used to pull him from half-sleep back in the city moments before an alarm rang or a wall gave way. He lay still, listening. Nothing obvious stirred. No footsteps, no wind shift, and yet the air felt focused. Jack slid out of bed and padded quietly to the window. The porch light still burned. The clearing beyond it was empty. Then something moved at the edge of the light. His breath caught. A shape stepped forward, smooth, controlled, almost unreal in its silence. The lioness emerged from the darkness, her coat catching the porch light in muted gold. Every muscle flowed beneath her skin as she moved, head, low, tail swaying in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Jack didn't move. She stopped at the bottom step of the porch. For a long moment she simply stood there, studying the cabin. The wood, the door, the windows. And then she lifted her head and looked directly toward where Jack stood, frozen behind the glass. It felt as if she could see him. Behind her another smaller shape appeared. The cub padded into the light, staying close to her leg. It sat and looked up at the cabin, blinking as if confused by this strange, glowing structure in the night. Jack's heart hammered. The lioness stayed where she was. She did not pace. She did not growl. She watched. Minutes passed. The world seemed to narrow to the hum of the porch light and the soft brush of grass under her paws. Finally she made a deep, low rumble, too soft to carry far, but heavy with meaning. The cub rose immediately. With a gentle nudge of her muzzle, she turned it away from the porch. Both of them melted back into the darkness, swallowed by the tall grass as quietly as they had come. Jack exhaled shakily and realized his hands were gripping the window frame hard enough to hurt. He waited a long time before moving. When he finally sat down at the small table, his coffee had gone cold. He stared at the door, replaying the image of the lioness standing at his steps, not as a threat, not as a trespasser, but as something else entirely. Checking, remembering. By morning, Jack needed to know whether the night had been real. He stepped outside with the sun just beginning to lift over the horizon. The clearing was still damp with dew. Near the porch steps, pressed deep into the soft soil, were paw prints, large, unmistakable, leading up to the edge of the wood. Beside them were smaller ones. The cub had been there. Jack crouched and touched the ground, his fingers sinking into the cool earth. A strange mix of awe and unease tightened in his chest. She had come back. Later that morning he radioed the ranger outpost. Mateo Reed's voice crackled through the static. "You're up early, Turner. Everything all right?" "I've got tracks," Jack said carefully. "Lioness. And a cub. Right up to my porch." There was a pause. Then a low whistle. "Storms push animals closer," Mateo said. "Happens sometimes." She stood there, Jack added, watching. Another pause, longer this time. "Just keep your lights on at night," Mateo said. "And don't go outside alone after dark." Jack thanked him and ended the call, but the knot in his stomach remained. That night he left the porch light burning again. He sat by the window listening to the savannah breathe. Every small sound pulled his attention. Every shift of shadow felt charged. Near midnight he stepped onto the porch barefoot, the air cool and clean against his skin. The moon hung low, a pale coin above the grasslands. Far beyond the fence line, something moved too steady to be a trick of light. For a heartbeat, Jack thought he saw a long silhouette slide between the trees. Then it was gone. He stood there a while longer, letting the night settle back into itself. Before going inside, he looked down once more at the paw prints by the steps. The rain hadn't washed them away. They sat there like a quiet message, one he didn't yet know how to answer. The air turned dry faster than Jack expected. Within a week, the grass around the cabin began to yellow at the tips, and each step across the yard kicked up thin ghosts of dust. The nights felt different now, too quiet, the insects falling silent earlier than they should have, the jackals calling from farther away. Jack had learned to trust those signs. He hadn't told anyone, not even Mateo, that the lioness's visits hadn't stopped. Some nights he caught her silhouette slipping along the fence line, a ripple of muscle and shadow under the moon. Once, just before dawn, he'd found the cub taller, now steadier, sleeping in the shade of his jeep. It lifted its head, blinked at him, then padded off into the grass, as if it had every right to be there. Jack felt their presence like an invisible boundary, something old and watchful, not close but near enough to matter. The calm broke one evening as the sun sank red and swollen behind the hills. Jack smelled it before he heard anything burnt oil and cheap cigarettes carried on the wind. The scent didn't belong to this place. He set his coffee mug down slowly and stepped onto the porch. Far across the plain, two sets of headlights bumped along the dirt track that led toward the reserve boundary. They weren't rangers. Rangers didn't move like that, didn't kill their lights every few seconds. Jack raised his binoculars. The vehicles stopped near a stand of acacias. 4 men climbed out dark shapes against the fading light. Rifles slung over shoulders, flashlights wrapped in red tape to dim the beam. Poachers. Jack's jaw tightened. He grabbed the radio and tried the outpost. Static answered. He adjusted the dial and tried again. Nothing. The last storm must have knocked the repeater out again. He was alone. The men moved along the fence with practiced ease. One crouched, cutting the wire in silence. Another scanned the dark with a rifle. A heavy sack was dropped near the trees. Jack stepped back inside and opened the drawer beneath the table. His revolver lay where it always did. 5 rounds. Old. Better than nothing, and nowhere near enough. He turned off the cabin lights. Outside, the savannah was moonless. Clouds swallowed the stars. The poacher's whispers carried faintly through the still air, sharp enough to set his nerves humming. Jack crouched behind the porch railing, heart beating with that old familiar rhythm, the one that had guided him through smoke-filled hallways and collapsing roofs. Outnumbered, outgunned, still breathing. Then a sound cut through the dark, a quick muffled cry, animal sharp with panic. Laughter followed. Jack's stomach twisted. They'd found something. A trapped antelope, maybe, or worse. He strained to see, but the only light came from their covered flashlights, slicing brief nervous lines through the brush. Then the wind shifted. It came from the south, cool and sudden, and with it came a sound that froze Jack where he crouched. A roar. Low, deep, steady. Not close, but close enough to feel. The laughter stopped. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. One flashlight jerked toward the ridge. Another roar followed closer this time, rolling through the ground like distant thunder. Jack's skin prickled. He knew that voice. The lioness. Shouts erupted among the men. One of them swore. Another shouted orders. A single gunshot cracked the night, lighting the grass for a heartbeat. Then chaos. From the tree line, shapes surged forward, 3, maybe 4 lions moving low and fast. Flashlights swung wildly, beams slashing through dust and fear. One man screamed, dropping his rifle as the lions burst from the dark like living shadows. The poachers broke. Boots pounded. Branches snapped. Engines coughed to life. Headlights flared as the trucks tore back down the dirt road, swerving in blind panic. Jack stood frozen on the porch, the revolver hanging useless in his hand. The lions slowed near the fence. The leader stopped just short of the broken wire. Even in silhouette, Jack recognized her, the lioness. Behind her stood a young male, now taller than before, the faint beginnings of a mane lifting along his neck. The cub. No, not a cub anymore. The lioness lifted her head and sniffed the air, then she looked straight toward the cabin. Their eyes met across the clearing. For a long breath, neither moved. Then she blinked slowly, deliberately once, twice. Jack swallowed hard. With a quiet rumble, she turned away, nudging the young male toward the open plain. The rest of the pride followed their bodies, fading into the tall grass until only the whisper of their passage remained. The night breathed again. Jack stood there long after they were gone, adrenaline leaking from his veins, leaving only disbelief and something dangerously close to awe. He stepped to the edge of the porch and stared at the torn fence, the trampled grass beyond it. Footprints were everywhere, human and lion tangled together. A scrap of fabric fluttered from one of the posts. Jack tore it free. It smelled of oil fear, and something else he couldn't name. Protection. He went back inside, hands still shaking, and poured himself whiskey instead of coffee. The amber liquid caught the lamplight as he lifted the glass. She had known. Somehow the lioness had known he was in danger. Jack glanced toward the wall where the camera feed blinked quietly, recording the porch in steady intervals. Tomorrow he would see it again, frame by frame. Tonight he sat in the dark and listened to the savanna recover crickets, returning hyenas, calling far off the slow sigh of wind through grass. And somewhere in the distance a single roar rolled across the plain. Not a warning, a declaration. Morning came gray and windless, as if the land itself were tired from the night before. Jack Turner hadn't slept. Every time his eyes closed, he heard the echo of that roar, the sound that had driven armed men into the dark like startled animals. He sat on the porch steps, boots unlaced, staring at the broken fence where the wire sagged in a crooked smile. Beyond it, the grass lay flattened and torn, the earth written over with overlapping stories. When the coffee went cold in his hands, Jack set the mug down and walked to the fence line. The mud there was churned into confusion, but some things were unmistakable. Human boot prints cut into the clearing, abrupt and uneven. Then, halfway across the paw marks began. Large, deliberate impressions crossed directly over the human tracks, claiming them, canceling them. Jack crouched and brushed a finger along one of the prints. Wide pads, deep press, the lioness. Beside her, tracks were others slightly smaller, less confident but steady. The young male. He wasn't a cub anymore, not in the way that mattered. The crunch of gravel behind him made Jack turn. Mateo Reed's Jeep rolled into the yard, dust trailing behind it like a flag. The ranger stepped out, hat pulled low, eyes already scanning the scene. "Got your message," Mateo said. "Heard a shot last night from the north end." He paused, taking in the fence, the ground. "Thought I'd find you gone or worse?" Neither, Jack replied. He nodded toward the clearing. They came through there. Mateo knelt, studying the tracks. "Poachers," he muttered. "We've been tracking this crew for months. Guess they got bold." "They didn't leave on their own," Jack said. Mateo looked up slowly. "A pride came out of the trees," Jack continued. "At least 4. Drove them clean off the property." Mateo straightened, disbelief flickering across his face. "You sure they weren't after you, too?" Jack gave a short, humorless smile. "If they were, they changed their minds." Mateo studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "You always did make friends in strange places." They spent the morning repairing the fence. The sun climbed quickly, heat pressing down as dust clung to skin and clothes. Mateo tightened wire while Jack hauled broken posts aside, his shoulder complaining with every lift. At one point, Mateo stopped and nodded toward the far tree line. "You see that?" Jack followed his gaze. Half hidden among the acacia stood a golden shape, still, watching. The lioness. She didn't retreat when she noticed them. She simply sat, tail curling around her paws, posture relaxed but alert. A queen surveying ground she already owned. Mateo let out a low whistle. "She's bold." "She's checking on me," Jack said quietly. Mateo glanced at him, then back at the lioness. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Looks like it." By late afternoon, the fence stood straight again. Mateo packed his gear and promised to send patrols through the west line that night. As the Jeep disappeared in a cloud of dust, Jack remained by the fence, eyes on the open plain. The lioness was gone now, but he could still feel her presence like a low hum beneath the ground. That night, Jack set up additional motion cameras, 3 around the cabin, 1 trained on the repaired fence. He didn't know what he expected to see, but he needed to know whether the night before had been a single act or the beginning of something else. Just after midnight, the first roar came. Not loud, not close, but deliberate. Then another closer this time. Jack stepped onto the porch, heart hammering, and looked out beneath the nearly full moon. Silver light washed the clearing. 5 lions emerged from the grass. They weren't hunting. They moved in slow, measured arcs, circling the cabin. Every few yards one paused, lifted its head, and scanned the horizon. Their paths overlapped, clean and purposeful. The lioness led them. The young male walked beside her, now taller than Jack remembered the faint shadow of a mane stirring along his neck. His head stayed slightly lower than hers respectful learning. Jack stood motionless. "They're patrolling," he whispered. As if answering him, the young male stopped near the spot where the fence had been cut. He lowered his head, sniffed the ground, then lifted his gaze toward the porch. For a moment their eyes met. The young male gave a soft chuff, brief, almost casual, and trotted back to the others. Something tightened in Jack's throat. The pride completed one final circle, then melted back into the tall grass, the night closing behind them like water. When Jack reviewed the camera footage the next morning, every frame confirmed what he'd seen. The lions moved with intention, not wandering, not marking territory. Guarding. At one point, the lioness turned toward the camera. Her eyes reflected the infrared light, two calm, amber pools. She stepped closer and brushed her flank against the fence post, marking it. Claiming it! Jack closed the laptop and sat back slowly. For the first time in years, his eyes burned, not from smoke, not from exhaustion, but from something quieter. Gratitude. He didn't know what to call what was happening. Science would find its words. Rangers would debate it. All Jack knew was this: he was no longer just living beside the wild. The wild was watching over him. The rains ended early that year. By the fourth week of the dry season, the land had begun to crack under the sun's weight. Grass bleached to a brittle yellow. Each step across the yard raised a thin veil of dust that hung in the air before drifting away. Even the wind felt sharper now, as if it carried sparks instead of relief. Jack Turner sensed it before he saw it. He was repairing the water pump when the breeze shifted, bringing with it a smell that did not belong: burnt wood, dry and bitter. Not the clean scent of a cooking fire, something older, hungrier. Jack straightened and scanned the western horizon. There it was, a dull orange smear rising behind the tree line, faint but growing. Smoke. The savannah was burning. He reached for the radio and called Mateo at the outpost. Static answered. He tried again, then again, adjusting the dial until his hand ached. Nothing. The fire had likely knocked the repeater out again. Jack didn't swear, he simply moved. Years of training took over the old rhythm, sliding into place like a muscle memory he thought he'd left behind. He loaded water jugs into the Jeep, grabbed a shovel and a heavy wool blanket, and drove toward the ridge where the smoke thickened. The closer he got, the hotter the air became. Ash drifted like gray snow. The sun burned red and swollen behind the haze. Animals were already fleeing. Zebras streaked east in tight clusters. Antelope bounded past with whites of eyes flashing. Smaller creatures scattered in frantic, unpredictable paths. Then Jack saw the darker shapes ahead. Lions. They were pacing near a stand of old thorn trees, caught between two advancing tongues of flame. The fire curled around them in a wide arc, tightening its grip with every gust of wind. At the center stood the lioness. Even through smoke and heat, Jack recognized her immediately. Ash dusted her coat. Her posture was tense but controlled. Around her pressed the pride, two other females, the young male and another youngster not much smaller than he was now. They were trapped. Jack didn't think. He parked the Jeep on a rise and ran the shovel clanging against his shoulder, the blanket dragging behind him. Heat slammed into his face like an open furnace. The roar of fire drowned everything else Wind thought fear. He crested the last rise and saw the full danger. The flames were closing in from both sides, pushing the lions toward a rocky ledge with nowhere left to go. Jack waved his arm and shouted, though he couldn't hear his own voice. The wind shifted just enough to clear the smoke for a heartbeat, and the lioness turned. Their eyes met through the haze, two living things locked in a world turning to ash. Jack ran sideways along the fire's edge, beating down small flames with the blanket, carving a narrow strip where the grass hadn't fully caught yet. His lungs burned, his eyes streamed. There he yelled hoarsely, "Go, go!" The lions hesitated. The young male roared, sharp, conflicted, torn between fear and defiance. Jack kept moving, clearing the path inch by inch, trusting that movement was better than waiting. Then the wind shifted again. Smoke slammed into his face. Jack dropped to one knee, coughing hard, vision swimming. He felt the heat press in from all sides. When he looked up again, the lioness was moving. She surged forward first, decisive. The others followed in a blur of muscle and breath. They passed within yards of him, golden forms cutting through red light and smoke. Jack staggered after them, swinging the blanket to knock down sparks. Then pain exploded through his left shoulder. A burning branch fell from nowhere, striking him hard. White heat flashed through his body. He went down the world, tilting violently. The roar of fire filled everything. Jack tried to rise, but his legs refused. Smoke crushed his chest. He fell onto his hands, coughing, then collapsed onto the scorched earth. The heat closed in. He was dimly aware of movement. Heavy paws thudding close air, shifting near his face. A deep rhythmic sound cut through the fire's roar. Breathing, Jack forced his eyes open. The lioness stood over him. Her flank heaved with effort. Ash streaked her face. Behind her, the young male circled once, growling toward the flames, positioning himself between Jack and the fire. Jack tried to speak. No sound came. His head sagged against the ground. The heat felt endless. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the lioness lowering herself beside him, her body angled toward the fire, shielding him, holding the line. Jack Turner came back to the world in fragments. The first thing he heard was water hissing, cracking as it struck embers, then voices urgent and overlapping. The deep thrum of helicopter blades beat the air overhead, chopping the smoke into pieces. Easy, easy. Hands gripped his arms and pulled him upright. Pain flared through his shoulder, sharp and insistent. "You've got him," someone shouted. "Watch the heat." Jack blinked, hard eyes burning. The smoke thinned enough for shapes to sharpen. Rangers, fire crews. Mateo's face appeared above him, streaked with soot and disbelief. "We've got you," Jack Mateo said, voice tight. "You're all right. Stay with me." Jack turned his head. They were still there. 6 lions stood in a wide semicircle around him, and the rescue team bodies, rigid heads high. The lioness was at the center, ash darkening her coat, her eyes fixed on Jack. The rangers hesitated, weapons half raised. "Don't shoot," Jack rasped. His throat felt scraped raw. "They're not here to fight." Mateo followed his gaze. His breath caught. "They're guarding you." The lions did not move. They held their ground as hoses sprayed, as the last flames died back under torrents of water. Smoke lifted, revealing a landscape blackened and steaming. Only when the danger passed did the pride shift. The lioness glanced once toward the fire line, then back at Jack. Their eyes met his, blurred and wet with smoke, hers steady and ancient. She turned first. One by one, the lions melted away into the scorched grass, silent and unhurried, as if the work had simply ended. Jack sagged as the tension drained from his body. The ride back to camp passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion. By the time they reached the field hospital, night had fallen again. A medic cleaned his burns, wrapped his shoulder, and shook his head in disbelief. "You're lucky," the medic said quietly. Jack didn't answer. Mateo sat beside the cot while rain finally returned, tapping softly on canvas. "They could have run," Mateo said. "Every instinct says, run from fire." "They stayed," Jack murmured. "So did I." Sleep took him then, deep and dreamless, filled with the sound of rain. The footage changed everything. Helmet cameras from the Rangers, aerial shots from the helicopter. Every angle showed the same impossible truth: lions forming a barrier, holding position, while humans fought the fire. Within days, word spread, at first only among rangers and conservation workers, then farther, faster. Videos circulated through quiet channels, then public ones. Headlines followed. "The man the lions protected." Some called it instinct. Others called it coincidence. A few called it something more. Jack didn't care. He lay in the field hospital, shoulder aching, smoke still lodged in his lungs, watching the rain stitch the land back together. When he could finally sit up, Mateo brought him coffee and shook his head. "You've got better neighbors than anyone I know," he said. Jack smiled faintly. They were here first. 2 days later, Dr. Sophia Grant arrived. She stepped into the tent with a notebook under one arm and eyes that missed nothing. Sun-lined skin, calm posture, a scientist's patience. She shook Jack's hand firmly. "You're the one who crossed a line and lived to tell about it," she said. Jack huffed a weak laugh, didn't plan on telling anyone. She sat on a crate beside his cot. We reviewed every frame. What they did wasn't panic behavior. It wasn't hunting or defense of territory. "What was it?" Jack asked. Sophia's expression softened. "Vigilance, protection, directed, deliberate." Mateo leaned against the tent pole. "You're saying they knew exactly what they were doing?" "Yes," she said, "and exactly who they were doing it for." Jack looked toward the open flap of the tent. Beyond it, the night glowed damp and clean. Somewhere far off, a lion called low and steady. Sophia closed her notebook. "When you're strong enough," she said, "we'd like to document this properly, carefully. No feeding, no conditioning, just observation." Jack nodded. "That's how it should be." That night, as rain whispered across the land, Jack slept with a new understanding settling quietly into his bones. The bond that had begun in mud and fear had now been witnessed by the world, and it was far from finished. Jack Turner returned to his cabin under a pale, forgiving sky. The fire had spared his home, stopping just short of the ridge, as if the land itself had drawn a line and decided that was far enough. Blackened earth marked the distance, a dark ring around the place he lived, a reminder of how close everything had come to ending. Mateo drove him back in silence. When the jeep stopped, Jack sat for a moment, taking in the familiar shapes. The porch, the solar panels, the water tank catching the light. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. "Need anything?" Mateo asked, breaking the quiet. "Time," Jack said. "And coffee." Mateo smiled and tipped his hat. "I'll send patrols through the west line. Take it easy, old man." Jack watched the jeep disappear before turning toward the cabin. Inside, the air held the good hush of a place that had been waiting. He washed a mug ground beans one-handed and set the pot to brew. The smell rose quick and comforting. He carried the cup out to the porch and sat. The wind moved gently through the grass. Birds stitched the air with quiet calls. The land felt calmer now, as if something unfinished had finally been set right. Jack didn't expect them to come. Miracles, he'd learned, never kept schedules. But as the afternoon leaned toward gold, the world changed texture. The insects stilled, not in fear, but in awareness. The wind softened. Then, at the edge of the clearing, a shape stepped free of the grass. The lioness. She moved unhurriedly, the confidence of something that knew it belonged exactly where it stood. Her coat was clean now, the ash washed away by rain. The scar along her flank caught the light as she stopped 10 yards from the porch. Behind her came the young male, taller again, his mane beginning to take form in uneven shadows. 2 other females followed, and then Jack's breath caught. A smaller figure threaded between them. Another youngster, legs still marked faintly with spots, curiosity bright in its eyes. Jack set his cup down slowly and stood careful of his shoulder. He kept his hands open at his sides and didn't step forward. The lioness sat. The others followed her lead, settling into the grass as if this were a meeting place they all understood. "Afternoon," Jack said softly. His voice felt right at that volume. "You look well." The lioness lifted her head. The look they shared felt like a thread stretched across a great distance, steady, unbroken. She breathed out a low chuff, warm and controlled, a sound that settled in Jack's chest like a hand laid flat. He didn't move closer. Some distances mattered, some spaces were part of the trust. The young male rose and padded toward the section of fence the poachers had once cut. He stood there broad and still, scanning the land beyond as if counting its edges. Then he looked back at Jack and gave a deeper chuff acknowledgement. Jack nodded once. The lioness stood. She stepped forward, not much, just enough to shift the air between them. Her whiskers trembled. She blinked slowly, deliberately, then blinked again. Jack lifted his right hand and rested it against his chest. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For the night at my door, for the men you chased, for the fire." The lioness answered with a soft rumble, brief, controlled, almost a syllable in a language older than speech. Then she turned. She nudged the youngster to its feet and led the pride back toward the tall grass. At the edge of the clearing she paused and looked over her shoulder once more. The young male mirrored her head tilted slightly as if memorizing the shape of the porch and the man standing on it. Then they were gone. The grass closed behind them, seamless and complete. Jack remained standing long after the last ripple faded. He didn't feel elevated or chosen. He felt placed, as if the land had set him exactly where he belonged. That evening, Mateo returned with 2 rangers to walk the west line. They shared beans and bread on the porch and spoke of small things. Weather, repairs, the stubbornness of old fences. When the stars rose bright and indifferent, Jack told them the Pride had visited. No one asked for details. Men who lived close to the wild understood there were conversations that didn't belong to words. After they left, Jack folded a blanket over the chair and leaned back, watching the sky deepen to blue. He thought of the day in the gully, the rope biting his waist, the small body trembling against his chest. He thought of the bow in the rain, the eyes at his doorstep, the roar that had driven men into darkness. He thought of lions standing between him and fire. He did not believe he had been chosen. He believed he had been answered. Before going inside, Jack walked to the fence post the lioness had brushed so many nights before. The wire hummed gently under his fingers. "Go well," he murmured into the open, "and may your cubs always find water." A faint breeze moved the grass. Somewhere far off, low and sure, a chuff rolled through the dark and settled in his chest. In the months that followed, life around Jack Turner's cabin returned to a quieter rhythm. People still came and went. Scientists with notebooks, rangers on patrol, a filmmaker who kept his distance and his voice low. Jack welcomed them politely, then let the land reclaim its silence. The Pride appeared when they chose to appear, and when they did not, Jack did not go looking. Trust, he had learned, was not something you chased. Some evenings he brewed coffee and carried 2 mugs onto the porch. He would set one on the rail, feel slightly foolish, and leave it there anyway. The second cup warmed his hands while the sun slid toward the horizon, turning grass into gold. Often nothing happened, and that too felt right. Jack understood now that the story people loved, the rescue, the protection, the fire, was only the surface. The real meaning ran deeper, woven into the way the land worked when humans chose humility over control. Lesson 1. Respect begins with restraint. Jack did not save the cub to become part of a story. He acted because in that moment walking away felt like a deeper harm. But what followed mattered just as much as the rescue itself. He stepped back. He did not claim. He did not demand closeness. In wildlife conservation, restraint is often the highest form of respect. Intervening once does not grant ownership forever. True protection means knowing when to act and when to disappear again. Lesson 2. The wild is not mindless. For years, Jack had been told that animals act only on instinct, that emotions like gratitude or loyalty belong solely to humans. The land taught him otherwise. The lioness remembered. She observed. She chose. Not in human terms, but in her own language, measured, precise, ancient. Her actions reminded those who studied the footage that intelligence in nature wears many forms. Understanding wildlife means listening without forcing human labels onto non-human minds. Lesson 3. Coexistence is not domination. Jack did not fence the lions out, nor did he invite them in. He maintained boundaries and honored them. The Pride responded in kind. This balance, close but not intrusive, protective but not possessive, is the foundation of coexistence. Conservation is not about ruling the wild or romanticizing it. It is about sharing space responsibly, accepting that humans are guests on land that remembers far older footsteps. Lesson 4. Courage is quiet. There were no crowds when Jack pulled the cub from the mud. No applause when he stood still before a lioness. No celebration when he ran toward fire instead of away from it. Courage, Jack learned, is rarely loud. It shows up in calm hands, in steady breathing, in the decision to protect life without expecting reward. These are lessons as valuable in cities as they are on the savannah. Lesson 5. Connection creates responsibility. Once the world saw the footage, attention followed. Jack had to make choices. What to share, what to refuse, how to protect the animals from becoming symbols rather than living beings. Connection to nature carries responsibility. When a story inspires, it must also educate. Wonder should lead to care, not consumption. The goal is not more stories like Jack's, but fewer situations where such rescues are needed at all. On one late afternoon, as the season softened and the wind carried the clean scent of rain far away, Jack sat on his porch and listened to the land breathe. Somewhere beyond sight, the lioness led her pride toward water. Jack lifted his mug in a small, private gesture to neighbors he would never touch, to a promise that needed no signature to a language older than fire and fear. He did not feel alone, not because the wild had come closer, but because he had learned how to stand at the edge of it properly. Close enough to respect, close enough to protect, close enough to learn, and that the land had taught him was enough.